Vito Marcelli was feared, Luca Ferraro was invisible, and Carlo Mancini was the one holding a secret that could destroy them both. In the shadows of Palermo's docks, their lives would collide in a story of power, betrayal, and a decade-long game that no one realized was being played until it was far too late. In the late summer of 1978, the city of Palermo was a maze of crumbling buildings, narrow alleys and dark corners where whispers carried more weight than the law. At the heart of this world was Vito Marcelli, a man whose life seemed at first glance painfully ordinary. He worked on the docks, unloading crates and barrels from foreign freighters, earning a meager wage and going home to a small apartment that smelled faintly of seawater and oil. But Vito carried something most dock workers did not: a hunger for more and an instinct for danger that seemed almost unnatural. Vito's first steps into crime were almost invisible. He began by taking small items from shipments, slipping them into his lunch bag or hiding them in the folds of his coat. At first, it was nothing more than coffee beans, cigars, or bottles of imported wine. These he sold quietly to local shopkeepers who asked no questions. He never took enough to cause alarm, but always enough to make a profit. The other dock workers noticed his sudden improvements: new shoes, a gold watch, but Vito brushed it off as luck in gambling. Luck was a convenient excuse in Palermo, a city where no one wanted to see too closely into another man's fortune. Then came the night that changed everything. A foreign freighter docked under a false name, scheduled for repairs after a supposed mechanical failure. Rumors swirled among the workers that the ship carried more than its manifest declared. Vito stayed late that evening, offering to help with the unloading. By midnight, most of the crew had gone home, leaving him and a few trusted men alone on the pier. When they pried open one of the heavy steel containers, they found not machinery or produce, but rows upon rows of rifles, ammunition, and unmarked crates filled with cash. Vito did not call the authorities. Instead, he made a decision in seconds that would seal his fate. He claimed the shipment as his own. The following days moved like a carefully staged performance. The weapons and money vanished into secret storerooms scattered across Palermo. Vito contacted men he barely knew but whose reputations for violence were well established. In exchange for a share, they swore loyalty to him, a loyalty that was sealed not with words but with blood. The freighter sailed away empty, its captain paid to forget everything he had seen. Officially, nothing unusual had happened. From that moment, Vito began to grow. He used the weapons to arm small gangs in the city, demanding their allegiance in return. He paid bribes to port officials, ensuring that no cargo passed through Palermo without his approval. Businesses near the docks began to rely on him for protection, and those who refused often found themselves robbed, burned out, or worse. The local police opened investigations, but they quickly stalled as witnesses failed to appear or withdrew their statement. In one case, a dock worker scheduled to testify vanished on his way home from work, leaving only his lunch pail on a bench by the sea. By 1980, Vito was no longer the quiet man on the dock. He dressed in tailored suits, his thick hair slicked back, his gold watch replaced by a custom-made timepiece worth more than a house in the old quarter. He moved through the streets surrounded by men who followed without question, their faces hard and unreadable. He had become the king of the docks, a title given to him by those who both feared and respected him. But even in his triumph there were shadows. Rivals began to take notice of his rapid rise, suspicious of how a simple dock worker had built such an empire so quickly. In smoky backrooms, names were whispered, men who wanted him gone, men who remembered the missing freighter and wondered who had really taken it. Vito ignored them for now. He believed his control was absolute, that the docks were his kingdom and he its untouchable ruler. But in the dark corners of Palermo, the seeds of betrayal were already taking root, and the same waters that had carried him to power would one day try to pull him under. Do you want me to expand Chapter 2 in the same detailed, suspenseful style so it matches this tone and pace? By the mid-1980s, Vito Marcelli's grip on the underworld stretched far beyond the salty air of Palermo's docks. His reach extended into Naples, Rome, and even small towns where his name alone was enough to silence a room. His empire was built on cargo routes, extortion rackets, and a network of loyal lieutenants who carried out his orders without hesitation. Among them was Carlo Mancini, a man Vito trusted more than most. Carlo was not like the brash enforcers who swaggered through the streets. He was quiet, calculating, and moved in the shadows. He handled delicate matters, the kind of work that required patience rather than bullets. Carlo had been with Vito since the early years, his loyalty seemingly unshakable, but beneath his calm exterior lay a dangerous ambition of his own. While others collected cash or delivered threats, Carlo kept record. Every meeting, every bribe, every act of violence was carefully written down in a small, leather-bound ledger. It was not done out of sentiment, it was leverage. Carlo knew that in their world loyalty could turn to betrayal in an instant, and information was the most powerful weapon a man could hold. The ledger was his insurance policy, though he never imagined he might use it against Vito, until opportunity arrived in the form of Enzo Belanti. Enzo was a rival syndicate leader from Naples, notorious for his taste for chaos. Unlike Vito, who preferred control and careful planning, Enzo thrived on reckless moves that kept his enemies guessing. He approached Carlo through intermediaries, offering money, protection, and a place of power in his organization in exchange for the ledger. To Enzo, the book was more than just a record, it was the key to dismantling Vito's empire piece by piece. For weeks, Carlo weighed the risk. He had seen men who betrayed Vito disappear without a trace, but he had also seen what happened to those who stayed too long in Vito's shadow. Eventually, they became expendable. Carlo decided the risk was worth it. A deal was arranged. He would meet Enzo on a rainy night in Naples, far from Vito's watchful eyes. The location was a dimly lit backroom of a closed cafe on a quiet street. Carlo arrived early, wearing a dark coat that clung to him in the downpour. The air smelled of wet stone and gasoline. He carried the ledger in a waterproof satchel, his pulse steady despite the stakes. The streets were empty, the only sounds the occasional splash of tires passing through puddles. He slipped through the cafe's side entrance, moving past overturned chairs and dusty counters until he reached the back room. The sight that met him stopped him cold. Enzo Belanti was slumped over the table, his head resting in a spreading pool of blood. A single clean bullet wound marked his temple, the work of a professional. The room was silent except for the faint drip of water from the ceiling onto the floor. Beside Enzo's lifeless hand lay the leather-bound ledger, but when Carlo opened it, half of the pages were gone, torn out with precision, leaving jagged edges like broken teeth. Panic flickered beneath Carlo's composed mask. The missing pages contained some of the most dangerous records, transactions involving high-ranking officials, secret arms deals, and names of men who would kill to keep their involvement hidden. Whoever had killed Enzo had taken them, and that meant they were still in play. Carlo scanned the shadows, feeling certain he was being watched, though he saw no one. He left the scene quickly, leaving Enzo's body where it lay. The rain had grown heavier, washing the streets clean, but it did nothing to ease the weight in Carlo's chest. Someone else now held the most dangerous parts of the ledger, and he had no idea who. Worse, Vito would eventually learn about Enzo's death, and when he did, suspicion would fall like a hammer. Carlo had tried to play two sides against each other, but now a third, unseen hand had entered the game, one that knew exactly where to strike. Do you want me to continue with Chapter 3 in this same style so the tension keeps building naturally? The murder of Enzo Belanti and the disappearance of the missing ledger pages sent tremors through Vito Marcelli's empire. At first he believed it was just another gang feud in Naples, a problem that could be contained with a few swift acts of violence. But within weeks, his certainty began to crumble. One by one his operations came under attack. A shipment of contraband liquor was hijacked on the open road and set ablaze in full view of terrified motorists. Two trusted collectors vanished, their bodies later found buried in shallow graves along the coast. Word spread that someone was cutting into his business, striking with precision and vanishing without leaving a trace. The streets began to feel different. Shops that once paid protection money without hesitation quietly shuttered their doors. Smaller crews that had pledged loyalty to Vito withdrew into the shadows, claiming they could no longer guarantee their safety. Rumors traveled faster than bullets. People whispered about a ghost in the underworld, an enemy who struck unseen but always knew where to hit. The truth was even more unnerving. This was not random chaos, but a campaign built on information only an insider could possess. Vito responded with fury. He ordered a purge unlike anything the city had seen in years. Suspected traitors were dragged from their homes in the dead of night, some were found days later broken and lifeless, while others simply disappeared. His message was clear: betrayal would be answered with blood. But the killings did nothing to stop the attacks. In fact, they seemed to escalate them. The strikes became bolder, targeting not just shipments and cash, but the very symbols of Vito's power. One of his warehouses in Palermo, fortified and guarded day and night, was burned to the ground in a single night. The man behind the assaults soon made himself known in whispers that carried through the back alleys and smoky bars. His name was Luca Ferraro, a figure so obscure that even seasoned criminals struggled to recall his origins. Some claimed he was a former soldier, others swore he had once been part of Vito's own crew. What mattered was his skill. Luca moved like smoke, never staying in one place for long. He struck with military precision, dismantling Vito's operations piece by piece, as if following a map no one else could see. It was that last detail that unsettled Vito the most. The way Luca operated was too exact, too informed. Every move suggested he knew the inner workings of the Marcelli network, the drop points, the bribe schedules, the unmarked accounts. Vito began to suspect the unthinkable. Luca had the missing pages from the ledger. The thought burned in his mind, twisting into those pages, if real, were more than evidence of his crimes. They were a blueprint for destroying him. The city descended into what people later called the blood season. Shootings erupted in crowded markets, cars exploded outside apartment buildings. The police, already stretched thin and riddled with corruption, were powerless to stop the spiral. Innocents were caught in the crossfire, and the fear that had once served Vito's rule now turned against him. His own men began to question his strength, wondering if their king had finally met an enemy he couldn't crush. For Vito, the war was no longer about profit, it was about survival. Every night he moved between safe houses, never sleeping in the same bed twice. His phone calls were short, his meetings even shorter, yet despite all his caution, Luca always seemed to be one step ahead, cutting deeper into his empire with every strike. The docks, once his fortress, now felt like a trap. He could feel the walls closing in, and for the first time in years, Vito Marcelli began to taste fear. Somewhere out there in the rain-soaked streets of Palermo, Luca Ferraro was watching and waiting, holding the final pieces of a game Vito had no idea how to win. Do you want me to now expand Chapter 4 in the same 600-word style so the story closes with maximum impact? In the winter of 1992, Vito Marcelli received a message that pulled him back to the place where it had all begun. One of his last remaining allies told him of a major shipment set to arrive at the Palermo docks before dawn. It was said to be worth millions, a cargo that could stabilize his crumbling empire and send a warning to anyone who thought he was finished. Vito, worn thin from months of losses, saw it as a final chance to reassert his dominance. He decided to be there in person, to make a statement to both his enemies and the men still loyal to him. The morning was cold and heavy with fog, the kind that swallowed sound and made the sea look endless. Vito arrived in a black sedan with a small convoy of armed men. The docks were silent, except for the faint creak of ropes and the lap of water against the hulls. He stepped out wearing a long dark coat, his breath clouding the air. In the distance, the shadow of a large freighter loomed through the mist, its deck lights glowing dimly like watchful eyes. They moved quickly, checking the pier for threats. Vito kept his hands in his pockets, scanning every shadow, every flicker of movement. He had learned over the years that danger rarely announced itself. It simply appeared, sharp and final. As they approached the ship, the fog began to shift. Shapes emerged in the distance, vehicles, silent and still. A moment later, the sound of engines broke the quiet, and unmarked cars rolled in from every direction, boxing them in. Doors flew open, and men poured out, dressed not in the street clothes of rival gangs but in tactical gear. Their movements were sharp, disciplined, practiced. Within seconds, Vito's men were surrounded, rifles aimed and ready. Confusion rippled through his crew, but Vito's eyes fixed on the man stepping out from the lead vehicle. He recognized the face instantly, Luca Ferraro, but Luca was different now. He wore no disguise, no streetwise smirk. Instead, he carried the cold authority of someone who had been waiting for this moment for years.
Behind him, another figure emerged carrying a weathered leather-bound ledger, its missing pages carefully replaced. In that instant Vito understood, Luca had never been a rival gangster. He was an undercover operative, embedded deep within the criminal world, building a case that spanned over a decade. Every move, every strike against Vito's empire had been part of a larger design to bring him down completely. The officers moved in. Vito's men, realizing the hopelessness of their position, dropped their weapons one by one. Vito stood still, the fog curling around him, his heartbeat steady despite the inevitability of what was about to happen. He had always known his life would not end quietly, but he had never imagined it would be in handcuffs on the very ground where his power had first been born. Luca approached, his expression unreadable. He handed the ledger to a waiting investigator, who opened it to reveal pages filled with dates, transactions, and names, evidence that tied Vito to murders, smuggling operations, and political corruption. Some entries stretched back 15 years, each one a nail in the coffin of his empire. Vito glanced at the book but said nothing. In his mind, the ledger had become a kind of mirror, reflecting both the rise and the fall of the king of the docks. The fog began to lift as Vito was led to a waiting car. Around him, the docks were alive with activity, officers cataloging seized cargo, photographing evidence, speaking into radios. It was the first time in decades that the port had been under the full control of the law. For the people of Palermo, it would be remembered as the day the Marcelli reign ended. For Vito, it was the morning the streets went silent, and the sea which had once carried him to power turned its back on him forever. If you want, I can now stitch all 4 expanded chapters into a single continuous documentary-style narration script, so it flows perfectly for a YouTube true crime video. That way, it'll sound like a seamless voiceover.